Yo, what's going on, family? My name is Matt Smith, aka MDS, the EQ coach, and welcome back to another episode of The Baggage Claim. This is the podcast where we unload all the things that we're carrying so that we can travel lighter through our lives at work, through our lives at home, and our journey through faith. And so, pack your bags, grab your courage. Let's rehuman together. Now, man, it's been a heavy time recently, and I'm not going to mince words. We're going to get right into it. Uh, Today, we're going to be talking about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And my hope through this episode is just to speak to not the circumstances themselves, but the heart condition that I believe we got to do some work to get to returning to. And of course, there's a lot to unpack, there's a lot to talk about. And of course, I'll give my perspective, but I'll also talk about a lot of things in objectivity. And I think this is a more nuanced conversation than just talking about the death of one man, or more particularly, the murder of one man. And so, buckle up, y'all. um, so, first and foremost, let me start by saying I've only been vaguely familiar with Charlie Kirk, right? I think, as most who, have lives outside of the internet, um, I didn't really fully understand the magnitude in terms of his popularity and notoriety. I remember you know, on socials would see clips of this guy going back and forth. And my initial impressions of him, and this was a couple of years ago, was that he was a little obnoxious, right? And, you always have the way I related it. I grew up in the hood. You know what I mean? I wasn't a hood kid, but I grew up in the hood. And I was placed into gifted and talented education, or the GATE system, when I was young. And that basically just meant that you were given a puzzle when you were in like first or second grade. And based on how you completed a series of puzzles, you were evaluated to be advanced in thought. I don't know. As far as I was concerned, I guessed on a lot of those puzzles. I lucked up into the GATE program, right? But I know that we were isolated in a lot of ways, and a lot of what the expectation was that we would excel academically. And so you would always find these kids in the GATE program who knew too much, you know, or that's the way it seemed. They always had an argument, or always had deeper research or deeper insight into a subject, and it seemed like they could retain everything, and they pulled no punches generally in telling you that you were wrong. And so that was kind of my first experience of Charlie Kirk. And I can't say that I was a fan or that I found him to be incredibly compelling. I just thought that he was a well researched dude and was always ready to prove somebody wrong. Now, my personal philosophy is you can either be right or you can be in relationship. And I'm not the first person to say that. You can either fight for your position of righteousness, or you can humble yourself and fight for the purposes of community and harmony. And I think if you go back and you look at a lot of his older stuff, you can see that he was kind of that guy. right? He was very rigid on, well, I won't say very rigid on his positions, but he was rigid on his positions. He wasn't afraid to tell anyone no. I remember I was particularly turned off by a comment that he made when someone was seeking to either gain more understanding or just have a conversation. And he pretty flatly, right out, said, "Yeah, I don't care about emotions." And up front, I thought that's a bad way to go, bro. You know what I mean? You at least have to acknowledge that one's emotions are valid. The experience that one is having, you're not able to make anyone a liar. And as I grew to one understand a little bit more of his position on things, um, a lot of the wealth of knowledge that he seemed to have, the deep research that he seemed to do, and how excellent he was academically, I grew in respect for him. I particularly am not a person, I come from the Encyclopedia Britannica age, right? And so I don't just form my opinion based on the soundbite or the clip or the little bit of information. I either am resolved to dive deep into a subject or I'm resolved to say, I don't know nothing about that, or I don't know enough about that to have an opinion. And yet, I believe that what he stood for, especially as he grew as a person, was the opportunity to have the closest thing to healthy discourse while still maintaining the integrity of the truth and presenting his opinion based on that foundation. And for that, I have nothing but respect. Whether I would, go and play basketball with the dude or whatever the case may be is a completely different story, right? But that lays the foundation for me as to how I would be willing to engage with another human being. I make the decision as to whether I'm going to keep you at arm's distance because everything about your communication has to do with your experience or your perception or your emotions, which again are valid. But then we unpack those things to recognize whether your emotional response to anything is actually grounded in the truth or if it just is based on how you perceive things and more importantly, the things that are being projected. And so, again, grew to have a tremendous amount of respect for this guy. And the more that I soaked up the content and the debates and things, the more I found myself even liking him, you know? And so that's the extent of what I know about Charlie Kirk. I didn't even know how old he was. You come to find that he was um, a um, he was on Fox News and things like that. And based on all of that, again, if I were to just take that in surface level, I could form a lot of opinions. Luckily, I'm not that guy, and I believe that it allows for an opportunity to go deeper and find out who human beings are at their core, starting with how they think and how that directly links to what they feel, how what they feel creates attitudes and behaviors, and based on those attitudes and behaviors, the results that they would then get. And so, fast forward to um, sheesh, just over a week ago, and I'm at work, and one of my coworkers says, "Hey, do you know Charlie Kirk?" I'm like, the name sounds really familiar, but I can't put my finger on who that person is. I couldn't put a face to a name. And she kind of goes on to start talking about the situation. I'm like, oh, yeah, no, I know who Charlie Kirk is. or she gives a description of who he is. I was like, oh yeah, no, I remember. He's the white guy who debates everybody, who kind of has a funny shaped head and has that haircut. You know what I mean? Um, and then she says that he was shot, and my entire heart sank. Now, luckily, I didn't see any of the videos. I know what was passed around more than anything was the video of him being shot. And if I can be honest, I think that is suggesting a very deplorable state of our society. When the news isn't enough, we need the imagery. And even worse than that, the imagery is what creates the virality. People were more interested in seeing this man being shot rather than hearing the news of him being shot. And to give a little bit of perspective on that, so I grew up in the era of Columbine. School shootings were unheard of, at least in the context that they are now. Unheard of when I was growing up. And then Columbine happened and it was broadcast news, and you see all the students running out of the school with the hands behind their heads, um, trying to make it out as safely as possible. And it was eerie. And 9/11 wasn't too long after that, which of course that's not a school shooting, but that's a national catastrophe. And then I got to high school, and again, I'm in the hood, you know what I'm saying? And my high school got shot up more than once. More than once. As a matter of fact, I remember kind of dating this this girl who was playing on the volleyball team. I think she was playing on the JV volleyball team at the time. I was a sophomore, um, when one of the occasions happened, and two of my friends, along with her, were standing at the entrance of our school when uh, could only assume affiliates of local gangs and things like that pulled up and shot up the school. And it wasn't anyone on campus. It was shooting from the exterior, which is still terrifying. However, I remember talking to her and she was shook for like months. I'm sure it was nothing that she had ever experienced before. She didn't grow up in the area. The only reason that she was at our school was because her parents worked in our district, and one of them worked directly at our school as a teacher. And so I remember at the moment thinking, like, yo, you never heard gunshots before? Again, I had heard them regularly. You know what I mean? Never did I think that they were coming from me specifically. It was just kind of the ambient noise of the environment. And yet, I remember the experience that she had and how I felt so helpless because there was nothing I could do to make her understand or to provide any level of comfort based on this terribly heinous occurrence. At some point, I had come to expect to hear gunshots. Like I said, just not on campus. And so there were probably two more times where we heard at some point in time that we were on lockdown and we would be exiting by building, that there were police surrounding the perimeter, and that effectively we would be escorted. And there was even, right, there was directive about where you should go based on where you were living, streets to not travel on, etc., etc. And the reason that I bring that up is because Charlie Kirk's last words, he was asked about mass shootings. And he said, does that or does not include gang violence? And man, whatever opinions that I could have had about him at that time, I thought that was a very empathetic place to form an argument from. I didn't feel marginalized at that moment. I didn't feel like a statistic at that moment. I didn't feel like he was trying to make a point necessarily at that moment. I felt like that was a man who likely had not lived an experience even close to one that was centered in gang violence and took the opportunity to advocate for an experience that he was unfamiliar with. I remember when the school in Sandy Hook got shot up and it got national coverage, and holding a lot of rage and resentment in my heart, seeing these little pale faced kids talking on TV about how angry they were. And my response was, nobody came to Rialto High. When we got shot up, there was no news coverage. Certainly it wasn't getting national media attention. Yo, so it only matters when a certain demographic has to deal with it. But I think that was the last time that I thought about potential lives being taken from my own biased and emotionally unresolved perspective. Every point after that, anytime there was word of any type of shooting, there was desensitization. There was a lot of, man, that doesn't surprise me. But there was still genuine heartbreak from the gay club in Florida to this recent shooting. What's wild is that I believe the same day that Charlie Kirk got assassinated, there was another school shooting in Colorado that got no attention. And I say all that to say that it is a dark place that we've gotten to. But I want to submit to you that it's not an unfamiliar place. It's simply an unresolved place. Hearing that Charlie Kirk was murdered, I think about the 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump uh, in the last year and a half or so. And this seems very reminiscent of the 60s, right? MLK got popped. Um, Bobby Kennedy got popped. JFK got popped. Malcolm X got popped. And from there, we moved into the free love revolution, right? And so, in a very weird way, I'm very intrigued to see what the society does to respond to this. What I know is that this wasn't just an assassination of a man or even an attempted distinguishment of his principles. This, in some ways, was a message from a community of extremists that would suggest that we're not allowed to disagree. If you think, feel, believe a thing in particular that would, at worst, be radically different than something that someone else believes, and at best, be minorly offensive that it justifies violence. And that will never be the truth, especially the taking of a man's life or a woman's life. This has been said before. I'm not going to be the only person to say it. I'm certainly not the first to say it. But man, that was somebody's son. That was somebody's father. That was a young woman's husband. And there's all kinds of scripture about how the job as a follower of Christ is to look after the fatherless and the widowed. God doesn't play with widows and orphans. He has a special heart for them. I think even considering that those who don't feel a sense of belonging, irony of that is that God cares about that person as well. I have to suspect that you would have to be an incredibly lonely individual to not value another person's life. That you would have to be an incredibly fearful individual to believe that because someone thinks or expresses any sentiment, whether it's factually based or not, expressing a sentiment that otherwise would alienate your experience would fill you with the type of rage to want to violently harm and kill another person. That has to be a lonely experience. However, what I think the follower of Christ is required to do is to recognize that the person feeling that, the perpetrator of the violence, is one who feels orphaned as well. And if there's anything that we have to respond with in this moment, it's certainly the call for justice. There's no escaping that. But the righteous position is to recognize that people who are violent are people who are violently hurting. I don't believe it's a matter of good people or bad people. I believe that there is evil in the world, but our enemy is not the people. Our enemy is the spirit behind the evil. There was a voice whispering to the perpetrator of the murder, beckoning him to perform in a way that was wildly inhumane. And if we're all being honest, each and every one of us has had those thoughts. We may have the conscience or the discipline or the community around us to convince us that those thoughts are destructive and that the actions that would come as a result of the thoughts are unnecessary, to say the least. And I certainly don't believe in giving any free passes. I believe justice has to be served. But the greatest tension in the follower, in the hearts of the follower of Christ right now, is asking the question, how do we allow justice, or how do we move for justice while still keeping our hearts in a place where they are softened, where we're compassionate, and where we seek to offer mercy, or at the very least, the opportunity for restoration or redemption. And of course, I'm not talking about the legal system. I'm talking about from heart to heart. Now, if we come to find that a person is consumed by the spirit of evil, and there is no regret, there is no remorse, there is no second thought, then ultimately God is the judge. Because again, I have to recognize the amount of times in which I've wished death on somebody else myself. And again, the thought, the inspiration is the force that we fight against. Certainly not the individual. What's most disappointing is seeing the response that favors the violence. I have to say that's terribly disturbing. People applauding or cheering or posting TikToks or whatever the case may be about being happy that anybody was shot and killed. Suffice it to say, you've never had that type of violence that you've ever had to deal with in your life. I remember when I first moved out to Long Beach, I was a young kid, 19, 20 years old, and was taking public transportation with a couple of, homies that I was living with. And it's like, just before midnight, walking down the street, just got off the train. And we're coming down 7th Street in Long Beach, which if you know, you know. You know what I'm saying? It's nothing to play with. Um, Coming down 7th Street, and I got headphones on, and I'm rapping some song as loud as possible. You know, I'm in the middle of the street. You know what I mean? I don't think I'm disturbing anybody. Um, and of course, it was some rap song or whatever. And what I knew was that I wasn't from nowhere. I wasn't affiliated with nobody. I didn't even really look like it. You know what I mean? But at least one of the cats that I was walking with did look like it. Could be mistaken from somebody from somewhere. You know what I mean? And so, out of nowhere, uh, we hear an expletive directed at a set in the area, and then we hear gunshots. And I was like, yo, that was for us. And so, we dip off the main street, run a little bit, hit a corner, hit a side street. And I remember the homie was like, we should be good. Just stay on the sidewalk. Not long before that, I had gone to a house party and everything was cool. As a matter of fact, it was in an area where I wouldn't have expected anything to go down. But some cats were there that looked like, you know what I mean, it was about it. You know what I'm saying? And so me and a couple of the homies I hung out with this clique of dancers, b-boys as a matter of fact, because we all danced in the streets. And out of nowhere, we having a good time, and shots ring out. Blah, 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 blah. And then the DJ is like, yo, everybody get down. And then, almost immediately after that, some cat pulls out a whole 12 gauge shotty out of a bush, cocks that joint, blows it in the air. Clack, clack. And the DJ's like, everybody get the out right now. And so, of course, I'm not going to be the one to hit no fence. You felt like, yo, I don't know who's still out there. We didn't hear no wheels peel off, none of that. So I'm not going to be the first person to hit no fence. I let a couple of other cats get up and get over a wall. And then when I didn't hear no screams, I was like, yo, now's the time to move. And so we did, slid in the car, peeled back to Rialto. Anybody out there who would think that at any point in time, being threatened, your life being threatened, could be anything other than a deeply traumatic experience. There's a lot that you got to unpack. If it happened to you, if it happened to your best friend, if it happened to brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, uncles, cousins, aunts, grandparents, you would have a completely different evaluation on the thing that happened to Charlie Kirk, especially recognizing that he was targeted. And all at the same time, I pray that you never have to experience something like that ever in your life. But I also pray that you grow in perspective, you grow in maturity. And you understand that if you feel like there's ever a place where heinous violence is justified, that you're not living in a real world. It's not all sweet and it's not that simple. I believe that we're way past the point of thoughts and prayers. And yet, what I know is that in scripture it says the prayers of a righteous man avail much. So those that are living upright, that do have love filled in their hearts, who are compassionate to all walks of life, now's the time. But more than that, I believe it is definitely our responsibility to be the people who don't just pray, don't just talk, but continue on with what Charlie started. And maybe in not the same approach, maybe not on the same platforms, but go and have a conversation with the person who's furthest from your thoughts or beliefs and see what can be done to get to a middle ground. And if we disagree, just agree to disagree. But I would have to ask how fragile, how delicate is your heart and psyche that if someone disagrees with you, even on values that seem to be common sense, core, and foundational for you, if your heart and your mind are that fragile, how could you consider that anybody else is the problem? So that's all I got for today. I appreciate everyone who's out there listening. I know that there's going to be comments on comments, but listen, the thing that I know I'm going to do Is if I disagree and I don't really have any other point of conversation or anything else to add value into any interaction that I have with somebody who may be disagreeing with me in the comment section, the thing that I'm going to say is thank you for your input and God bless you. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I would rather allow for that to be said in love than to try and speak something to destroy or tear somebody down rather than build them up. Because at the end of the day, we're all human. And that's valuable. That's valuable. I appreciate y'all. This podcast is brought to you by MDS, the EQ Coach, and Rehuman, our flagship products and workshops, a veritable EQ gym where you get the opportunity to have real reps in placing yourself in situations and conversations like these that touch on some of the most daunting or some of the most uncertain emotional and psychological places that we find ourselves amidst conflict or even amidst conversation. And so if any of those workshops sound good to you, not only do we have Rehuman Next Gen for middle and high school kids, but we also have our Rehuman corporate workshops for institutions, organizations, corporations, etc. If all of that sounds like something, and man, it seems like we need that more than ever. If that sounds like something that's interesting to you, send me a DM, and you can find me on all the socials, MDS EQ Coach. Until next time, yo, be love, for real. Travel lighter. I mean it when I say I love y'all.